President Zelensky's meeting at the White House with President Trump this week certainly went a lot better than the last time he was ambushed at the Oval Office. But is there actually any substance to the talks right now, or indeed Keir Starmer's coalition of the willing?
We speak to former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who says that Trump is yet to actually put any pressure on Putin, and that what we saw was really just theatre.
Effectively, we could be in a position of guaranteeing President Putin's plan and security, which involves the most strategic part of the Donbass region, which would allow Russia to further invade Ukraine from a position of strength in the future. So we have no detail of any of that. I can say the one thing that we know after yesterday is President Putin, yet again, has made absolutely no movement whatsoever towards peace. In fact, he was firing missiles into Ukraine yesterday.
Well, let's speak to former Secretary of State for Defence Ben Wallace to ask what he thought about it. First of all, Ben, what did you make of the Prime Minister's presence at the table?
Well, the plus side was one of the few things that makes Putin question what he can do in the future is an international united front. One of the major things he underestimated before he went into Ukraine was he calculated that the international community would flake and it would all be over in a few weeks, and he got that wrong. So I think the plus side that the European leaders of the major countries were all there at Washington alongside Zelensky, I think was an important message both to Donald Trump and indeed to President Putin. But I think it really all stopped at that point, messaging. I'm not sure anything really got progressed of anything solid, and they all tried to make their chip-ins, as you noticed, in a way that flattered President Trump. And really, we didn't see what went on in private. That's obviously what often happens. People are always cautious when the cameras are in the room. But ultimately, I think nothing really came of it other than to say we're all united. And the one thing that's important was Donald Trump might have realized, and I wrote in my Telegraph column a few months ago, that unless the people with skin in the game is in the room, whatever you agree with Putin turns out to be relatively pointless. You have to have the stakeholders around that table. So we got there. That's not a bad thing. I can't really see what any of them offered.
Well, hang on a minute. Let's refer to your latest but one Telegraph column, which is headlined, and it came after the Alaska summit, Putin played Trump like an agent handler plays an asset. You've been really critical of the US president. Hasn't there been some progress under his watch? Because we now have security guarantees and even actually Trump failing to rule out US troops on the ground to protect the future of Ukraine yesterday. And we have him pushing Putin into a trilat, or a meeting of three different parties now: the US president, the Ukrainian president, and the Russian president. And actually, if Putin turns around and tries to block that, he'll look like he's the one trying to prolong the war. So actually, strategically, Trump has played it rather better than you had suggested after Alaska.
No, I totally disagree.
Right.
We haven't got any security guarantees. We've got the potential of a security guarantee with absolutely no detail. We also don't know what security we're supposed to be guaranteeing. If as Donald Trump had suggested the swapping of land, and Witless Witkoff had suggested handing over land that hadn't even been taken by Russians, effectively we could be in a position of guaranteeing President Putin's plan and security, which involves the most strategic part of the Donbass region, which would allow Russia to further invade Ukraine from a position of strength in the future. So we have no detail of any of that. I can say the one thing that we know after yesterday is President Putin, yet again, has made absolutely no movement whatsoever towards peace. In fact, he was firing missiles into Ukraine yesterday. President Putin has been constant and consistent, to be fair to him, in refusing to make any movement towards any compromise on this issue. He ruled out yesterday the possibility of European or NATO troops in Ukraine. which is going to be vital for a security guarantee. So unless President Trump turns around and says to Putin, well, lump it, we're going to do it, there is no security guarantee of note or of detail that's been trailed, I'm afraid, Camilla. So I couldn't disagree more with your proposition. He hasn't actually confirmed the trilateral with Putin. He suggested it. The Kremlin has said nothing at all on that subject. And I think we still have a long way to go. What we do know from the White House was a briefing that the Ukrainians, lucky old them, are going to be allowed to spend 100 billion euros of European money on American equipment. That isn't really going to help the broader security of Europe. I think that shows that a lot of this was more about going. I think they went over there to try and buy Donald Trump. And basically, we have yet to see Donald Trump put any pressure on Putin. Hasn't changed, Camilla, since Alaska. If you saw at Alaska, Putin went niet. Donald Trump very quickly moved away from a ceasefire requirement, if you remember, which was really important originally. Chancellor Merz made that clear yesterday. And as soon as Putin went niet, Trump turned to Zelensky and basically said, I think you need to do something.
Ben, if I may, how do you explain to the casual viewer then why the atmosphere at yesterday's summit was so positive? If indeed Ukraine is being sold out, why did Zelensky behave as though he had a win, as if he was delighted to be there and America was backing him to the hilt? Why did the Europeans sitting around the table all say, Mr. President, thanks to you, we have made steps towards peace? The casual viewer looking at that will think, it looks like the allies are very happy with Trump's leadership, and yet you're saying they're getting nothing.
Well, I think what they're trying to do is bring President Putin, get some pressure put on President Putin and bring President Trump away from his drift towards the Russian lines and the Russian view of this war and bring him over to their side. And I think turning up and shouting at him is not going to help, and turning up and trying to pick a fight wouldn't help. And at the very least, that didn't happen yesterday. But if we look at any solid measures that will bring Putin to the table, they have not been achieved as yet. I'm allowed to throw bricks and mortar at Donald Trump because I'm not in office or in government. But I don't actually see any actions to date that have been anything other than avoiding putting pressure on President Putin and in turn returning some of that towards putting pressure on President Zelensky, I'm afraid.
In which case, if the Europeans were groveling, does that not just remind us of their failure to act independently of America? That I
Yes.
know you make an important point in your Telegraph article today that actually it's incorrect to say Europeans have not spent money on this war. They've spent a lot of money and given a lot of material, and much of what's being done now is being purchased from America rather than America donating it. The president has it in his head that America just gives stuff away. It's not true at all. But for whatever reason, the Europeans have failed to come together as a coherent, independent military force, and that's why they have to turn up and grovel to the president, because they still rely on America to guarantee Ukraine's future.
Well, I totally agree with that point. That I've been writing in my columns for nearly a year that ultimately Britain and other countries have to put their money where their mouth is. And to be fair, there are a few countries in Europe who really are. Germany, Poland, Scandinavia are really spending money now on defence and increasing their capabilities. Britain, on the other hand, has had an SDSR that's more hollow than a Swiss cheese, and where the money isn't actually due to increasing defence spending till roughly 2028, 2029. And all we've got was Treasury tricks, where they have tucked under the intelligence services budget to artificially impress Donald Trump at that summit in The Hague with these wild claims of 2.6% of GDP growing to 5%. At the moment, if you ask people in the armed forces, they are going through cuts at the moment. So I totally agree on that. And it's been like that since 2014, when President Obama was very clear that Europe had to step up. And if we'd all acted on that, and that includes my own party, who continued to cut defence. 2015, George Osborne imposed a cut of 7% on our defence budget. If we'd actually been spending money properly and matching growing threat, we would not be in this position we are today.
I was going to raise that political point just because there is going to be a great irony here if by the end of this parliament, Labour ends up spending more on defence. Keir Starmer, a man who propped up CND-loving, peace-loving Jeremy Corbyn for 4 years, ends up spending more on defence than the Tory government.
Well, I think, first of all, if the end of this government is in 2028, and you remove the tucking unders, that's the folding in the MI6, MI5, GCHQ budget, and indeed the Ukraine spending, which under my day I wouldn't let be tucked under, as we call it, I think it is unlikely they'll be spending like for like in the real terms what I handed over, which was £30 billion more, or £24 billion more in my time. However, it certainly won't be the step change that is required. But it is also the case that the last time a government genuinely spent 3% of GDP, 3% of GDP on defence, it was a Conservative government. But that doesn't let any of us off the hook. You know, both Conservatives and Labour have hollowed out defence basically since 1991. There's been a few spikes, but overall, you cannot escape that fact. And the very first time we had a real turn of that corner was Boris Johnson giving me the 16 billion growing to 24 billion pounds increase, genuine money, not hocus pocus efficiency savings and all the other stuff that we have seen in the past. But I'm afraid we've returned back to the world of hollowing out, which is of great concern to our armed forces and indeed to our security.
What do you think is the worst case scenario in terms of a geographical carve up of Ukraine? What must they absolutely not allow to go?
The worst case scenario is that they concede Putin's ambition of the whole of Lushansk and Donbass, and he gets the very strategic part of the Donbass that is important for any future invasion, which is, I think they call it the forest belt up in the northwest of the country. Very, very important area. And they give him ground that he hasn't already taken. And Putin concedes nothing at all. I think that's the first. He doesn't give anything back at all. That would be very, very wrong. And he would walk away, Putin, knowing he can change borders by force and win. I think the other thing that would be very, very bad is if we publicly concede that Russia gets a veto over membership of things like NATO or Europe. One country like America can say we will never let Ukraine enter, but other countries should be allowed to continue their support for a Ukrainian membership. America doesn't have a right to stop Britain telling people they can or cannot join Ukraine. Of course, as its unanimous decision-making body, any country, including Hungary, could veto new entries. That's just the reality of it. But remember, the principle here is Russia shouldn't be telling other sovereign states what they can and can't do. And in fact, Russia and Putin has signed up to numerous agreements where they respect those rights, allegedly. And then I think lastly, what we shouldn't do is make security guarantees the beginning and the end. What the security is we're going to guarantee is as important as the guarantee itself. And there will be a danger in the sort of day-to-day media to say, look, we got a security guarantee. And then what we end up doing is finding ourselves in a Balkan situation where we get stuck, thousands of troops are stuck, effectively policing Ukraine in a front line that suits Russia, allows Russia to go off and rearm and pose threats elsewhere on the European continent, while we're stuck, as they say in military terms, we are stuck in a strategic dilemma with our forces fixed. And then Russia does what the Bosnian Serbs did so well, which is use militia and non-aligned armed groups to effectively humiliate, provoke, and snatch along that border without us being able to make any action in return at all. Are we going to trigger an Article 5 over what Russia used with little green men coming into Crimea? Are we going to see the humiliation of Western troops who, let's say, get sniped at from a position that's apparently occupied by militia, not Russia? I mean, what are we going to do in that situation? That could be very dangerous. We all saw what happened to the UN in the Balkans And I wouldn't want to see a repeat of that.
How else, though, could Trump have handled Putin? I mean, we had the discussion about Alaska. You were very clear about how you felt that the whole scene was humiliating and that Putin had been playing the US president like a fiddle. We then had Boris Johnson saying that the red carpet being rolled out and Trump referring to Putin as the boss was vomit-inducing. But there needs to be a degree of pragmatism, surely. I mean, Putin would not have entered into the talks if the red carpet wasn't rolled out, for instance. If you have to engage with a murderous war criminal, you have to do it in a manner on the world stage to presumably slightly inflate their ego so that they are willing to enter into the talks in the first place. How better could Putin have been managed at that point?
Well, look, having a meeting is just a meeting, red carpet or not. But the fundamentals here was, you've got to have a meeting for a purpose, right? So was that purpose of that meeting in any way to put pressure on President Putin? None. And what we have seen all the way through, and unless you can point to an actual occasion where Trump has followed through on his threats to increase sanctions. If you remember, it was all going to be done by, I think, the 18th or the whatever. And if it wasn't, there were definitely going to be secondary sanctions and sanctions on everybody. That hasn't happened. And time again, if you're a parent and eventually, you tell your children don't do this and they still do it and nothing happens, well, we all know what happens. People just continue to do what they were going to do. I have yet to see a single example of Putin being under pressure from the United States. And maybe you can give me some examples, but I haven't seen any.
How would they apply more pressure? I see what you're saying about sanctions, but what, until the point of dropping bombs on Moscow? How do you force somebody like Putin?
President Trump could have followed through on his sanctions. He threatened sanctions numerous occasions if we didn't get a ceasefire, remember? I mean, so give an example. At that conference, at the Alaska event, Trump basically accepted the removal of a ceasefire being a prerequisite only, 5 or 6 days since he said it was a requirement. And if there wasn't a ceasefire, he was going to follow through with sanctions. So he could have said at that meeting, thanks for coming, Mr. Putin, but if you're really not interested in even having a ceasefire, and remember the night before the summit, Putin sent more drones into Ukraine. Thanks for coming. But unless by the end of this meeting, we have some ceasefire agreed, I will be imposing those sanctions.
I know, but then
Perfectly able to say that.
One wonders whether sanctions would ever work. You've still got loads of European nations, the very ones that are appearing in the room next door and arriving by car to great fanfare, literally freebasing still Russian gas and oil.
Well, I'm not sure which ones are in that group. The Hungarians are, the Slovakians are, but there is certainly an issue where Russia. Don't think that Russia isn't finding it hard, all these sanctions. If you look at the direction of its arrows and its economy, there hasn't been a catastrophic collapse, but it's selling its oil and gas at a discount to India and China. You're seeing oil revenues down by about 30%. You're seeing inflation going up, interest rates going up, and it's had to go on a total war footing. There are sanctions that could be brought to bear. The United States could do more sanctions, especially around secondary sanctions. And you're right. I mean, Hungary would not like secondary sanctions on it by the United States. But it's a legitimate point to say early on in these years ago, the Germans were busy buying gas and doing pipeline deals with the Russians at the very time Europe was expecting America to spend more on defense. And I think Trump said that in Trump 1, and he was right. I don't disagree with that.
I guess the million-dollar question here is, if you were president, what would you do? Considering that the war is now 3 years long, it's in some sort of state of deadlock. It doesn't. We are well away from the era of Boris Johnson talking about taking back all of Ukrainian territory. Crimea is gone. What would you do in that circumstances that can realistically get a better deal out of Putin than what Trump is trying to pursue?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't have stopped the military aid from the United States to Ukraine or elsewhere. I would have continued to do that. Secondly, what I would have done is I would have been far more robust with the sanctions and stricter on the shadow fleet of oil tankers around the world, as we know Russia have been using that. And you can do all sorts of sanctions around the insurance industry and around secondary sanctions on people who are found to be trading and using loopholes to get through that. Thirdly, I would have been prepared to make sure that I reinforce further with my military other borders with Russia, create a strategic dilemma for Russia rather than the other way around. Where is Russia vulnerable? It's vulnerable in its navy. It doesn't have an army at the moment that isn't other than focused in Ukraine. I would have created a strategic dilemma. What I would have done, which wouldn't have cost me anything at all, which is what I think sadly Donald Trump did on day one of his second term, was I would have taken away hope from Putin that we aren't going anywhere. Hope is really important in all of this battle. On day one of the invasion, the mission was always to give Ukraine hope that they could resist. They had that hope because the international community was strong. As soon as Donald Trump walked into the White House the second time round, all his language, all his talk about, berating Ukraine, taking the line that somehow they were provoked, gave hope to Putin that just a few more months and he'll get his way. Hope. I would have reinstalled hope that I ain't going anywhere, Mr. Putin, and nor is the international community.
You know President Zelensky quite well. You've met him on a number of occasions. Where do we think he is at right now? Clearly, it went a lot better at the Oval Office yesterday than it had on the previous occasion. Take us inside his mind right now, Ben Wallace.
I think he's, Ukraine is a democracy. He's got to balance different political voices. There'll be hardliners, there'll be hawks, there'll be doves, just like any other political system. He will be trying to recognize the difference between, maintaining the principled position that we shouldn't reward the invader, that we mustn't be seen to give away Ukrainian land that hasn't been fought over or indeed hasn't been taken, but finding a way to get some form of peace and balancing the short term with the long term. Now, the long-term hope for Ukraine is that it gets to join the EU or that it gets to become economically powerful and successful. And that's the best way to show Russia and Putin, it's the best way to defeat Russia and Putin is to say, one of your neighbors now looks, with a GDP per head and a wealth, and now looks like Scandinavia, or it looks like countries that people want to be part of, rather than your country. That's the long-term way of demonstrating to Russian people that the Western way of life is the better way of life than the corrupt, crooked, criminal gangster state of Russia. So I think that's the first thing that he's got to balance, short-term versus long-term. But he's also got to balance a very deep-held view that I would agree with, that Putin can't be trusted. I mean, he just breaks every agreement he ever makes. How can anyone trust him, whatever piece of paper he signs? And that's why making sure he navigates the right security guarantees and the right security endpoint with, what he's going to try and have to sell to his people, because a lot of them have given their lives to defend their nation. And I think that's why, there has to be some form of carrot and stick that he's going to have to craft. And it's not going to be easy because President Putin is going to be sitting there bombing most days. And that's why, Chancellor Merz and the Europeans, and while we didn't hear Keir Starmer say it, the European position is strong, that you have to start this with a ceasefire. I mean, I think the ceasefire is important because it also is the true tell of whether Putin wants peace. We hear Donald Trump say, stop the killing. Okay, let's stop the killing. Let's start with a ceasefire. And the one person who isn't interested in the ceasefire is President Putin.
I suspect Trump would say he doesn't want a ceasefire because he doesn't want it to become a frozen conflict. But do we all accept now that the security guarantees you referred to...
But I thought Donald Trump wanted to stop the killing.
Yeah.
A frozen conflict would stop the killing, right? I mean,
right.
North Korea, South Korea, it's not the best solution. But if he keeps saying, my number one aim is to stop the killing, Mr. Putin, let's stop the killing. Niet. okay, right, let's go do something else.
But you can stop the killing for good if it is a long-term peace agreement rather than
Let's just stop the killing.
a short-term ceasefire. But anyway, do we all now accept that this future will not mean membership of NATO? It will mean some sort of defense agreement? And is that why the summit was so vague? Precisely because you're not going to come out of it with, and Ukraine will be in NATO, because it's too provocative to Russia. Russia will never accept it. And even the Ukrainians now acknowledge that that formal alignment with the West is now off the table.
I think it's off the table for now, simply because one nation can veto anybody else joining NATO, and that is the real politics. Britain, Estonia, Scandinavian countries can say as long as they like, we want Ukraine to join, but as long as either the White House says no, or Orban says no, there's nothing we can do about it. Right? That's just the fact, and I think everyone knows that fact. It does mean also that we can all maintain our positions independently, knowing that the truth is it can be vetoed, right? It's not what I would want. It doesn't mean to say you're breaking your principles, and Ukraine know that. They've known that since that Romania NATO meeting all those years ago, if you remember, where some nations were keen and France and Germany weren't, which was about 15 years ago, I think. Memory serves me right. So it's been a reality of the simple structure of NATO. But it doesn't mean to say, Donald Trump or any other president of the United States cannot bind his successor any more than British prime ministers. And that is a reality. So I don't think people can use the word never. It wasn't that long ago that Putin had apparently muted to Lord Robertson his interest in joining NATO himself.
Final question, Ben Wallace. Have we lacked leadership here? I mean, Keir Starmer likes to be abroad a lot. He likes to be on the world stage. Downing Street announced with great fanfare that he was going along to Washington without actually saying he was going to be joined by other European leaders. How's your analysis of how our own Prime Minister has been handling this?
Well, on the plus side, he's been consistent on his support. But, words have to be matched by action, and soft power has to be matched by hard power. And what we've seen is Britain is now tumbling down both the spend level and the leadership in NATO. I think we're about 9th now. I think when I was in, we'd got up towards second highest spending in NATO. Germany, Poland, Poland's not far on track for overtaking us. Certainly by GDP, it already has. We're starting to lose our leadership, both within NATO and indeed within, I think, the international community about our role both in Ukraine, but also in being able to deliver something. I mean, this thing about, the coalition of the willing and we could all deploy troops to Ukraine. The answer is what troops, right? I mean, we're stretched. We've got a battle group in Estonia. We had huge gaps in our army's ability to be enabled to deploy. I remember getting told off by Number 10 for admitting we couldn't actually deploy our division. We were massively short of trucks and things like that you need. And we're back to that old sort of habit of Number 10 promising things, but not being able to fund or refusing to fund it properly. I remember a very, very senior NATO officer from a country in Europe said to me, why does Britain constantly write checks it cannot cash at NATO? And we're being found out, and that's really sad. And we need to, if he puts his money where his mouth is, we start to invest. Rachel Reeves is told to stop mucking around and tucking under. These are I'm told two things. I'm told, first of all, that there was a decision that they would fund from the reserve. I'm not sure we actually have a reserve, Ukraine. And then the Treasury has stood in and said, but hang on, we need to do a value for money test on that, right? Which is one of the Treasury tricks to long grass something. And I'm also told that John Healey is refusing to ask for more money. So he's neither being a defense secretary first, he's being a politician first, and the Treasury isn't funding it anyhow. So we'll just drift further down the tables, lose our leadership, pose around, but not really make a difference. And I can tell you who's going to take the leadership in Europe on defense. It will be Germany, closely followed by Poland.
Ben Wallace, thank you very much.